So succession planning, the biggest thing I think I wanted to focus on with everybody with succession planning was really about making sure we were maintaining a yield as we were moving from one system to the next. And I'm going to show a couple specific, well, one main specific examples and a few others for us to get some inspiration from. But succession planning mostly is about that transitioning. Sometimes it's talked about as replacement planning, and that can be more in like a business model. If you were to go from one boss or a person at a hierarchical position, you kind of leading the way of everything to another. How do you plan for a smooth transition of management? But you can really think about it as moving from one system to another. So from annual plantings to perennial plantings is a good way to think about it. Where else can it apply? It can apply to plant management on grazing lands. We can think about going from maybe a small selection of pasture to a nice diverse pasture, or from degraded lands where we're seeing a lot of these quote unquote invasive species to more of the native species coming back. We're thinking of transitioning of our lands like that. Again, our crops from annual to perennial. We can think about it from our projects or our businesses. Oh, go back. And land ownership or stewardship. There's a lot of great examples of how do we pass off the land too when we're thinking of putting all of this time and energy into developing these beautiful permanent systems. How do we make sure that they're passed off in a good way? So we can start thinking about it like that. And we can even think about it in terms of rehabilitation of the land. So turning it back into a wetland, which it once was, or maybe where it's appropriate to be. Things like that, we're transitioning. And so having a succession plan can be important. The Savory Institute talks about the rule of succession, which states that a species will move into an environment when the conditions are suitable for its establishment, and will move out of that environment when the conditions become unsuitable for its reproduction. So we can again think of it in that way of pasture land. I like to think of grazing animals. So when you think of weeds in a pasture land, oh no, what do we do about these weeds? Well, when we start to change the condition, those weeds or indicator species are no longer going to be as prevalent. We're going to be allowing other things to move in, other plants that are more beneficial for us. Same with people on a site. If we have a farm that's really welcoming, we're going to start creating more opportunities for community events maybe, or for vertical business planning where we have multiple farms all working, or farmers all working off of the same farm in a beneficial way. When we start to think about creating the environment and allowing the environment to see that succession happen, we can do it with a little less maybe top-down management and a little bit more of like a nurturing care transitioning. So I learned to kind of think about it like that. But the biggest thing when we're thinking about making these types of transitions is we're going to go from year one to year 5 with something like this. But what about year 2, 3, and 4 in the middle? And what do we do in terms of feeding ourselves, having an income? If like we have a farming enterprise or something that we have a real livelihood off of in the land, how do we make sure we maintain a yield in this transition time? So I'm going to show you an example of a design that I did. This is one of the first times playing with an online sort of design software. So it's a little glitchy, but it's a good example, I think, of this type of succession planning. So this was a piece of land that was industrial farmed. And then we have a group of Indian farmers who were moving here. And they bought this big piece of land. I think it was about 250 acres. Just all industrial corn, soy rotation. And little by little, they're planning to come and build tiny homes and start farming in a lot of a subsistence farming type of way. So a permaculture plan really suits this type of succession really well. So we go from, instead of just going from, okay, here's our master plan, now go, how do we actually get there? So we want to think about, I often try to think about at least a 5-year transition. And I try to design for a 5-year transition. If you're going from a massive radical shift like that, you want to think of how can I be slowly starting to do this and blocking it out. So for something like this, we had orchards already planted, just the trees, just one layer of a food forest. So the thinking here was, okay, we're going to get the first person on the site And the part of maintaining the yield was the trees are going to be starting to produce in about year 2 or 3. We're going to start planting some understory, and they're going to have their market garden, and they're going to begin. They're going to have what they need in terms of subsistence living from the land. And the main thing here, really, in order to figure this out, is listing what are your yields? What are the desired yields? What do you actually need your site to do for you? Do you need it to feed you and your community and your family? How many people? Do you need it to generate an income for you? How much? Actually figuring out what you need, what the yields that are required, and knowing what you need compared to maybe what you want on a year by year basis will allow you to start figuring out this type of succession. The following year, we had the second dwelling built. We had a greenhouse set in. The common area was developed. We've planted our long-lived big fruit trees. Here, it's a lot of the overstory trees, the big chestnuts and nut trees that we have, as well as a lot of the perennials and a lot of the pollinator plants. You're kind of creating pollinator corridors. In the third year, we're starting to introduce animals into the system. We have the next farmer who was very interested in rotation grazing coming on site. Now we have permanent paddocks that are going to have electric fence being moved between them on a day-by-day basis to do mob grazing. We have the orchard starting to produce. And so as things are producing, we have this idea of like, okay, we're going to plant this thing, and about 5 years down the road, it's going to be producing. So what do we plant now in order to have there be continual yield all the way along? And the 5-year larger market garden back down to the 10-year plan. So this is one example of moving an annual production system into a more of a perennial production system. Obviously, with their desired yields, they wanted to continue to maintain some annual garden production. So it was a mixed system in this case. But if you're moving all the way, one of the biggest things is knowing how long it takes before you can actually start to expect a yield from these things, and making sure you have enough of your annual gardens producing in the meantime. What other succession models are there, though? There's this great couple, Kirsten and Serenity, that are featured in the Open Food Network here in North America. And they say they found ecological agriculture to be really labor intensive, particularly in the startup phase. So there are rewards, but increased labor often requires a more collaborative way of thinking if it's going to be successful. And their farm succession has been really interesting. They've gotten Serenity's mother, who owned the family farm. Instead of doing a traditional passing off family farm, what they've done is transferred the land into a family trust. And then the family trust, over an 80-year period, pays the registered charity sort of in this like peppercorn, tiny amount over 80 years. And the payment and transfer of equity like that was happening in order to improve the ecological function of the land. So this was happening by having farmers share the land. So there were a number of farmers that had been able to come onto the land, have this long-term assurance of being there. They were able to, again, work with a vertical business plan as they were implementing a lot of these ecological systems. So for them, they were feeling that that type of cooperation in order to make the system happen was really important. They were working with a large piece of land. And the actual land transfer also happened in a really beautiful and creative way. Rather than just from private ownership, it went into this charity trust. This is also a friend of mine that I wanted to highlight, just again, to give some ideas and inspiration of what we can be talking about here. Dan Jason's out on the West Coast here in Canada, and his farm was owned by a really good friend of his who he actually mentored under and farmed under for a number of years. Dan Jason's an amazing heritage, open pollinated seed saver and grower, and has written many books on local food systems and seed saving as part of an important part of that. And the land that he farms on was owned by this mentor of his, and gradually over time, the men who owned the land saw Dan's commitment to it and it was passed off in this 20-year period where the wish of the elder farmer was that he be able to live out his years on the farm. And so slowly the farm responsibilities, all the farm chores, all the maintenance work, all of the bill paying, all of the costs slowly transferred from this one person to the next in this beautiful succession plan that also included the mentorship and the training and the know-how. And that was a non-family transfer as well, which is also a really interesting thing to notice. Of course, there's generational succession planning. So we can think about family skills, trades, family businesses, again, the land stewardship, even our ways of being. When we think about integrating ourselves in permaculture, we can think really about all of the ways of being that we're developing in terms of our habits and closing the loop and small and simple solutions. All of these things that we integrate more into our life are also things that we're passing down, and we can, it kind of an unconscious succession planning is happening, or we can do it a little bit more consciously and think about our role in that way. Again, thinking about the yield throughout is so important. So on your site, what really is your desired yield for it? Is it food for your family again? Is it a livelihood, habitat for local wildlife, food for the pollinators, education for local youth? Are you really focused on a farming enterprise for your site? Is it a social enterprise for your site? What is it that is the really the focus of your desired yield, and how do you transition and move through what was being done before into a more permaculture approach to doing it in a way that makes that yield something that's easy to maintain. And so, yeah, that's sort of the like a big broad picture of succession planning. And I kind of want to bring it back to what are the things that are most interesting to you or that you're most interested in, and just leave that image again of that the 7 generations and thinking about succession planning in this way. So again, we think about our 3 generations behind us, our great grandparents, our grandparents, our parents, and then we think about us here now. And then in the teachings I receive, we think about our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. So when we're thinking of 7 generations, we don't have to try to be conceptualizing this 7 generations way ahead of us down the road, because that can seem really inaccessible. And when we're thinking about it in that way, front and behind us and ahead of us, it seems a little bit more practical, and we can think about our succession planning in a little bit of that way too.